Hi, I'm not sure if everyone can hear me. I'm having technical difficulties. My video, um, for some reason, is not working. But let me start off by saying good evening and welcome to our first speaker series, Fostering Diversity and Inclusion in the Entertainment Industry. First, let me start off by saying if the video was a little glitchy for you or you weren't unable to hear it, this video will be shared on our social channels. Also, this speaker series is being recorded. For those who don't know me, I'm Shelley Kratzer, Committee Chair, and on behalf of Film Row League Committee members Melanie Valera, Frank Martinez, Carl Lugier, and Otto Tony Graham, we would like to thank you for joining us today. Also, a very special thank you to Will Rogers Motion Picture Pioneers Foundation and Film Row for all of your support. Now, you may be wondering, what is Film Row Lead? We started only a few months ago, and our mission at LEAD is empowering underrepresented minorities in the industry through education and career development. At LEAD, our goal is to gain understanding, compassion, and unity through leadership, education, advancement, and diversity. For more information about LEAD, you can visit filmrow.org. During this series, should you have any questions for our panel, please comment below in the Q&A section. In the last 10 minutes, we'll try our best to answer as many questions as possible. Now that we have all the housekeeping out of the way, let's get started. Our moderator for this evening is currently Vice President of Content and Programming for Harkins Theaters, where she transitioned from her previous tenure at AMC. Driven by her passion for mentoring young professionals, advocating for others, and driving positive change within our industry, she has been featured in Box Office Magazine, delivered sessions on behalf of NATO's webinar series, served on NATO's Young Members Committee, and is currently serving on the executive board of Will Rogers Motion Pioneer Foundation. She holds a PhD in Industrial Organizational Psychology from Kansas State University and currently resides in Scottsdale, Arizona. Please welcome Heather Morgan.
Oh, thank you so much. Shelley, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, perfect. So for everyone looking at the screen, it's not just you who's seeing that. We are having some technical difficulties, which we are getting sorted out. So thank you so much for bearing with us. But as we have all been quarantined and working from home for an extended period of time, I'm sure that no one is a stranger to having a tremendous number of audio calls where we can't necessarily see faces. So if that lasts for a little bit, we'll, oh, hey, hello, everyone. I have the honor and the privilege and the pleasure today of being your moderator, and thank you, Shelley, for that introduction. We have a fantastic panel today, and I think that that has been the spurring factor behind the very positive reception we have gotten to this panel discussion. We have a tremendously large number of people who have dialed in and joined us today. So without further ado, I want to introduce the panel that you are all waiting to hear from. First up, we have Kimberly Graham. Kimberly is the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at the Nielsen Company. She's responsible for inclusive talent and culture practices. So from recruiting and interviewing to onboarding and development, her focus is on ensuring that the internal processes are inclusive and that they positively impact Nielsen's objectives and the diverse talent experience. She also manages 5 of Nielsen's 9 global employee resource groups. So welcome, Kimberly. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. Next, we have Rolando Rodriguez. Rolando is the chairman and president and CEO of Marcus Theaters, the EVP for the Marcus Corporation, and the elected vice chair of NATO. In addition to his many community leadership and fundraising roles, Rolando leads multiple Hispanic initiatives, including as the inaugural chairman for the newly created Milwaukee Hispanic Collaborative. He used his passion for film and culture to launch Cine Latino, which is an annual Hispanic film festival. And he's also earned accolades within our industry as the Milwaukee Business Journal Diversity Awards recipient, Man of the Year by the Motion Picture Club, and Executive of the Year by the Hispanic Professionals of Greater Milwaukee. Thank you, Rolando, for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Looking forward to it.
Wonderful to have you here. Next, we have Todd Vredenberg. Todd is the Executive Director of the Will Rogers Motion Picture Pioneer Foundation. Since 1997, he has been leading and driving change from within the organization's 3 distinct programs. They include the Will Rogers Institute, which as many of you know is known for its in-theater fundraising initiatives, the Pioneer Assistance Fund, which is a program that provides both financial benefit and counseling to members of the motion picture industry, and Brave Beginnings, which provides critical equipment for hospital neonatal intensive care units, which is an effort that he spearheaded in 2015. Before joining Will Rogers, Todd held leadership positions within the American Heart Association, the National Multiple Sclerosis Society, the Lego Toy Company, and Professional Sports Publishers. Welcome, Todd. He often waits to respond to me. And then last, we have Wendy Armitage. Wendy is the Senior Vice President of Marketing Clearances and Feature Ratings at Sony Pictures. For the past 7 years, Wendy was an executive advisor for OUT at Sony Pictures, which is their employee business resource group for LGBTQ+ employees. Her work with OUT at Sony Pictures landed her on Variety's Power of Pride 2020 list in June as a proud executive. This year, she transitioned out of that advisory role and joined the Sony Pictures Action Initiative, which will provide financial support to organizations that are dedicated to racial justice and reform, while also building and expanding on the studio's internal diversity and inclusion program. So thank you so much, Wendy, for being here.
I'm happy to be here.
Oh, it's wonderful to see you all. Thank you. So diversity and inclusion is not a new topic to anyone, but it has received increased attention and conversation and passion as of late based on certain current events. And I think it's an excellent time for all of us to engage in meaningful conversation. We have a lot of one-off conversations within our industry about how we can potentially take a more active role and if we need to take a more active role in this discussion. And this provides us all an opportunity to come together and leverage your expertise and find out how we're currently doing in terms of diversity and inclusion and if and how we can be doing more. So without further ado, I'll get started. Wendy, if you don't mind, I'd like to start off with you. To level set the conversation, how should we be thinking about diversity and inclusion in terms of defining them for this conversation? Because they're defined differently depending on who you talk to and in what context. So for our purposes, what are diversity and inclusion?
I think the way that I've always looked at diversity and inclusion specific to the entertainment industry is that we create product to entertain people, and that group of people is a very diverse group, right? So I think of diversity and inclusion specific to entertainment is, are we representing the audience that we're making films for, that we're making TV shows for? Are we representing the public that is coming into our theaters to watch those films? Are they coming into a concession stand and seeing somebody that looks like them? The Gina Davis Institute has an amazing saying, if you can see it, you can be it. And to me, that is the penultimate of what our industry should be looking for as far as diversity goes. Inclusion is sort of the conversations around it, right? Welcoming everybody in, welcoming all different viewpoints, all different voices, welcoming of everyone, right? So, diversity to me is almost the external look, right? Whereas inclusion is the internal work that we have to do to make sure that we're respecting and accepting each other and the conversations and the viewpoints that each of us very uniquely have.
And that's excellent. Thank you. Rolando, I'd like to ask you for a moment, how do you feel like we are doing as an industry in terms of our diversity and inclusion initiatives?
So I'll tap into some of Wendy's comments, and in particular, talk a little bit about our industry. And so when you think about our industry, number one, and we talk about diversity and inclusion, a couple of the things that come to mind. First of all, I want to wish all of you happy Hispanic Heritage Month, which we don't necessarily talk about, but that actually happens to be September 15th through October 15th. And so let's start just with that, right? Have we even mentioned that, or have we even discussed that? Now, why would that be important? Not just because I'm Hispanic, but by the fact that 24% of our attendance that comes through the door on a business basis happens to be Hispanic. About 16% of our attendance that come through the door happens to be Black and African American, and about 7% happens to be Asian. And so if you start, speaking about diversity and inclusion, one is important because of the makeup of our product and who we serve, right? Very important. And then you talk about the fact that clearly and very important, diversity happens to be females. By the way, I'm the father of 4 women, which I love for all of them to lead companies out there. Well over 50% of the audience happens to be female. So now, how are we doing? Leading up to your question, we finally have started to see female heroines, right? Wonder Woman, and what that means, you know. So now you can actually see it on screen. It's not just the person that's serving you at the concession stand or selling you the popcorn, but you're actually seeing a heroine on the screen that you can actually relate to and say, wow, there is inspiration to aspire to do greater things. Black Panther, what Black Panther did, obviously, for the Black and African American community. These kids finally got to see somebody on the screen that said, oh my God, look at that. That person looks like me. So I'm still waiting, by the way, for the Hispanic, hero to show up. And in fact, just so you know, I've even offered my services. I figured that we could have El Tigre Latino, but I haven't had any takers yet.
Wendy, this is a shameless plug directed straight at you on behalf of Sony Pictures, by the way.
Shameless plug. But look, I think to summarize it, it's very simple. I think that our country, and in particular our industry, has started to move in the right direction. I guess that's the way I would summarize it. And I think that we still have a long ways to go. And the fact that we are an amazing art form that really touches people's lives and entertainment and bring fun and actually education into our environment, we have that great opportunity to make a huge difference in our country, especially in a time where social awareness has really, blossomed.
Agreed. Kimberly, I'd like to take it over to you. So both Wendy and Rolando pointed out that we have a tremendous amount of diversity in terms of the people that we serve. And we are starting to see more and more diversity in terms of the faces that we're seeing on screen and the pictures that are coming to us. Now, do you have a sense, as Nielsen is the keeper of all things data related, do you have a sense for how we're doing in our boardrooms? We know that our guests are diverse and we know that our characters are starting to be diverse, but in terms of the people who are working within our walls and leading our companies to help bring those films all the way through the pipeline to where audiences can see them on screen, how are we doing from a diversity and inclusion perspective?
That's a great question. I would say that there's certainly, from the Nielsen perspective, we call ourselves the arbiter of truth, right? And so we want to make sure that the populations that we are representing and measuring are actually fairly represented across the markets that we serve. And so when I think about going into the boardrooms and the corporations that are making those decisions, there's certainly some opportunities, right? We do see some gaps when it comes to large populations and representation across our diverse groups. And how does that affect kind of what you're seeing on screen and how it trickles down into some of those decisions that are being made? It's huge, right? I think that what's important is the people who are making those decisions should have diverse perspectives and voices at the table to help advocate for groups and populations that are not represented equally or even proportionately. And so there's a lot of work to do when I think about the makeup of corporation leadership, and certainly, when it comes to our inclusive talent practices, right? Thinking about the talent that we're bringing into organizations, those people who are hired to make those decisions, we should be thinking about their diversity makeup as well.
Okay. Todd, are you ready to talk to me yet?
Yes, my apologies. I was sitting in a different chair with my little Surface device, and as soon as that video started, my device crashed.
That's what you get for trying to iPad us.
Crashed. So I had to regroup and come into my messy office and sit at my desk. And so, sorry, this is me.
Well, we won't judge. Thank you for being here. So you've heard the conversation up to this point about where how we have a need to be diverse and inclusive, and how we have opportunity to improve that. Based on some of the conversation, and I haven't talked to the group about this, but based on some of your previous experience with the Rose Bowl and also within the industry, what are some of the most effective steps that you have seen groups take to try to increase the amount of diversity amongst their decision-making body when they realize that they might not be as diverse as they'd like to be?
All right. Well, my true experience has been with the Rose Bowl and Rose Parade. I was brought onto the executive committee as what they call an at-large member. Pasadena went through a big heap of turmoil over diversity, probably going back about 15 years now. And what the agreement was that this group would bring on 5 executive committee members from the community at large, and they would represent the minority population. By the way, sidebar, some people look at me and go, what, huh, Bradenburg? Yeah, it's a surprise when people find out, but my mother is Black, or was Black, she's deceased now. My entire family on my mother's side are all from Louisiana. So yeah, I may not look the part sometimes, but I definitely represent that part of the community, and those are the neighborhoods I grew up in. So to answer your question, in short, what we found was just bringing people into meetings, bringing people into discussions that you normally wouldn't talk to, that you normally wouldn't even think about. And one of the problems we had was with identities. You would hear descriptions when you'd say, well, what about, I'll just random name, Joe Smith. And you'd say, what about Joe Smith? And they'd say, well, yeah, he's okay. He's not. There was this double standard for the minorities in the organization. They had to be perfect. And that was ridiculous. And when you start identifying, saying, I know that's what you want, but you're not perfect. Look around the room. No one here is perfect. These people have something to contribute. And believe it or not, they see the world the way you see it. They like what you like. They have the same interests. So once we start bringing people in to different committee meetings, bringing people in to different social events, and they had a chance to interact with these people, they found out, oh yeah, you bleed Tournament of Roses red just like the rest of us. You care about this community just like the rest of us. And that started to really make a difference.
So you're saying that we tend to judge members of a group that we see as different from ourselves potentially more harshly than we judge people who look and sound and have the same background that we do.
Yeah. The sociologists, I think, call it the mirror effect. They look in that mirror and they don't see themselves, so they think, oh, they're different. They're not like me. And believe it or not, they're a lot like you. They just don't happen to look like you. That's all.
That's interesting. So Kimberly, can I take it back over to you for a minute, because you have extensive experience with employee resource groups at Nielsen, seeing as how you oversee 5 of the 9 of them currently. Employee resource groups are all about bringing people together who are of similar characteristics or dispositions. So there might be a women's employee resource group or an LGBTQ resource group. And Wendy, I have some questions I'd like to ask you about that in a minute. But when it comes to formulating employee resource groups, one of the common concerns or complaints from members of the majority, members that are not included as part of that group, is that it presents an unfair disadvantage to them. Similar to how sometimes research shows that members of the white community will feel like they are actually the recipients of discrimination as opposed to members of the Black community and different groups such as that. So have you encountered that in some of your work, that when you're trying to gain momentum for an employee resource group, you have members of the organization that are not supportive of that initiative because they feel that it is exclusive to members of the majority?
Yeah, that's a good question and an interesting point. I think so. If I think about the affinities that our employee resource groups represent, they span a lot of different affinities. So not only racial and ethnic representation, but also gender, military, mental disabilities as well. And so the way we have positioned our employee resource groups is that we absolutely want these group programs to be a support system for the employees of which they belong to those affinities. However, we absolutely encourage allyship, right? So you might not see yourself in a particular affinity. However, if you have the interest and the education in order to help support those groups that have been identified as mission critical, right? So if I think about some of these affinities that are mission critical to the representation, to the innovation and business growth of large corporations, we want to make sure that their voices are heard. And so we really want to encourage people who don't see themselves or who might be a part of that majority, using their power, using their seat at the table, using their privilege to sponsor, to advocate for, to mentor, and to lift up some of these affinity groups who might not have that same opportunity that they have been afforded.
And have you encountered any resistance where people are less likely to put their support behind a group like that or lend their sponsorship to an employee resource group?
You know, I wouldn't call it resistance. I would say there's a bit of hesitancy. I think that people, you know, and certain groups might not have the education, the awareness, might not know how to start those conversations to show that they want to support, right? One of the things that we did as far as our structure was there were people who heard about our employee resource groups, who wanted to be involved but didn't know what to do and didn't want to raise their hand because they weren't Black or they weren't a female or, you know, whatever that affinity might be. And so we really have developed these inclusion impact teams at a local level so that if you're not sure where to raise your hand and you don't feel comfortable speaking up for someone, we gave you a platform to be a part of a team that is driving our diversity and inclusion initiatives across the corporation. So there's other ways to get involved. So there might be some hesitancy. If I do see resistance, I say that it's usually met with conversation. I think that at Nielsen, we've been having lots of town halls, lots of educational seminars, lots of open dialogue. We actually call the series Diversity Dialogues, where we want to create a safe space for those people who are unsure to ask those questions, right? I think that if you are in, you know, you live your lifestyle and you're always surrounded by people who look like you, who think like you, and the only, you know, diverse experience you get is at work, we want to make the workplace a somewhat safe place for you to be able to ask those questions if that is the only area in which you are getting that exposure. And so that's really how we try to position that experience, is that it should be enriching for all groups and that everyone can benefit, because ultimately diversity is a superpower, right? And it's helping us drive business growth and innovation and being able to respond to the market. And so everyone wins.
Wendy, I'd like to ask you a couple follow-up questions based on what Kimberly had to say with allyship. So again, in the current 2020 environment, based on recent events, we have seen, we have seen an emergence of white allyship. So people who are white, who are vocal on behalf of persons of color, or we have seen, you may have found this with your Out at Sony Pictures group, but there are people who are cisgender or heterosexual allies that are avidly supportive of an LGBTQ initiative, but sometimes people that are not members of that group, to Kimberly's point, just don't quite know how to start engaging in that conversation. What steps have you found to be effective to encourage people who want to be supportive of a cause, but who are not necessarily a member of the group that they're fighting for, to be comfortable coming forward and being involved?
You know, I think one of the things that I've done in any group that I've spoken to, so as my time overseeing the LGBT group at Sony Pictures, the thing I would do is tell everybody that if you want to have coffee and talk, just ping me. I'll have coffee and talk to anybody. Anybody that goes to one of those meetings, anybody that is listening to, a talk that I'm giving, anybody who's on this, I will go have coffee virtually right now with anybody. And I think that allows this approachability to somebody who may have a seat at the table. And to me, I had some amazing conversations with people that would never speak up at meetings, that would rarely attend any of these meetings. But I was able to take their ideas and help get them heard. And so I think that's the approachability of executives who are sort of spearheading some of these groups is vitally important to making sure that introverted employees, because that's what usually the people who won't speak up and who won't put themselves out there, they're usually a little bit more introverted, I find, and they're better one-on-one. And so that's what I would do. And I don't know if that answers your question, but that's the direction I would go, is just make myself very approachable to anybody who had an idea or wanted to get involved or wanted to figure out how to support, but just wasn't really sure which direction to go.
So whereas you are having one-to-one type conversations, Kimberly and the Nielsen Company is having town hall discussions specifically around diversity, but it's essentially, the premise is the same. It's to create a smaller, more tightly knit group where people feel safe to start exploring and having that conversation if they're just not sure what their place is.
Yeah. And I think right now during this very specific time that we're in, I've seen an uptick in engagement. People are more actively engaged in doing meetings like this where they can kind of hide behind their computer screen a little bit, but learn a lot, and they can participate a lot. They can ask questions in the Q&A that they may not, in a room full of people, raise their hand and start talking. But I've seen a lot more engagement in Zoom meetings and these digital meetings that we've been having.
That's a good point. Rolando, based on what you do at the Marcus Company and your community involvement, have you encountered something similar where people of a majority group want to get involved or they want to advocate for a cause, but they don't necessarily feel comfortable or they're not aware how to? Let's say you have men that would like to be more engaged in the conversation around gender equality, but they're just not sure what their place in that conversation is. Have you encountered that, and how have you fostered that?
You know, I would answer that. The answer is yes on all of the above. But I think that you know, I've had this conversation even with my associates, and clearly there's the diversity discussion right now in racial discussion that's obviously taking place in the social experiences, and even the Caucasian males, right? They're saying, are we now becoming an obsolete aspect? As an example, right? So that becomes a very dangerous place, because then we're not being inclusive, and we're losing that. And we have to be very careful that as we have this dialogue, you know, that's the reason behind inclusiveness, is that everybody actually thinks about this. Now, the positive nature that I see is that millennials see no color, see no biases. And I think that's our future, right? And Generation Z is even getting better at that. And the fact that, you know, if you look at the millennial population and the Generation Z, most of them, actually the majority of them, happen to be of diverse nature. So this is the growth in the generation that's actually going to lead. Now, what's the challenge right now is that it's right now, most of the corporations, most of the boardrooms are led by individuals that, like you said, may be afraid to involve themselves into this conversation because it's somewhat new. And by the way, it represents change, and change is hard, right? How do you bring, you know, more females into the boardroom? How do you bring more Blacks into the boardroom? How do you bring more Hispanics into the boardroom? And that conversation now has to take place with my fellow CEOs and in the marketplace to say, look, the reality is that the marketplace is changing, and how you reach, at least right now, the leadership of these companies is based on the fact that it's good for business. It's not just the right thing to do. We know it's the right thing to do, but it's also good for business. If you're missing out on this movement where Generation Z is, and who the millennials are, and who the present and future workforce is going to be, who the future consumer base is going to be, and who the future leadership is going to be, then you're basically not really thinking about the long term of your organization. And that's whether you're in any consumer facing business, whatever business you're in. And so that dialogue is starting to take place. I think that the social dynamics that are currently taking place in our country have really awoken that moment, right? And so you're seeing, for instance, in Milwaukee, where MMAC, which is kind of our major chamber of commerce, has now come out with a region of choice. And the reason behind it is they want to see 25% increase in diversity in management and leadership roles, right? So now these cities are taking stronger positioning on how do they change that dynamic. And by the way, that has to be top down, bottoms up, right? And the only way that we're going to see that change, we have to see changes in the boardrooms. We have to see changes in leadership positions. And by the way, when I say bottoms up, that means that the generation sees the millennials need to prepare themselves to take on those leadership roles. And that means that we have to be willing. I mean, my daughters, I tell them all the time, you need to be prepared. You have to be able to work, you know, put the work, deliver the results, and by the way, pay it forward for other leaders along the way. So those would be some of my thoughts on that.
Todd, I see you nodding. I'd like to take it to you for a second. based on your experience in the industry and the people that you interact with on a regular basis, one of the barriers that is often cited around why we are not more diverse and inclusive is that many people do not truly feel that we have a diversity and inclusion problem, that we are diverse and inclusive enough. Based on the conversations that you've had with people, have you encountered that, where there's a sentiment that we don't really need to do anything differently than what we've been doing for decades past because we're already diverse and inclusive? Or do you think that it's there is an issue where people recognize that we need to do better, they just don't know how?
I'll be honest, I don't believe until a few months ago, I don't believe there was any recognition that we have an issue. It was, look around, look how diverse we are. We have females, we have homosexuals, we have a few minorities. We're great. Look at it. We're Hollywood. We love everyone. There was just zero recognition that the community lacked a bit of diversity. And for those of us who look around and know better, go, wow, you don't really understand the community at large. I think it's been eye-opening, and if there is an industry that will take note of this and try and make some changes, I think it is this industry. I live in a town where there's lots of bankers and lots of lawyers and high finance types, and they are shell-shocked right now. I was just talking to a good friend of mine who was in my wedding, who was a white guy, who's in the insurance business. And he's had a very successful career. And he called me out of the blue. He said, "Todd, I'm sorry. I had no idea it was this bad." I said, "Yeah." He goes, "Why didn't you ever tell me?" I said, "I tried." I've made comments about places and things, and I said, you just kind of laughed it off. So I just kind of said, okay, this is the way it is. Let's just keep working. So I think the industry is awake now. I think this is a real moment in time, and we'll see where it goes, but at least people are paying attention.
So speaking of that, you raise an interesting point that I'd like to take over to Kimberly for just a minute, again, related to Nielsen and the data. So it is often perceived that there isn't really a lack of diversity issue. And also, I think members of our community that don't incur racism or biases in any way, they tend to underestimate the prevalence at which racism and biases do occur. And one of the the research shows that one of the most effective ways to combat that is for people to share personal stories. So just as Todd was alluding to with his friend, he tried to say things over the years to, raise awareness that there was an issue going on that needed to be addressed. How can individuals and how can companies start to be more comfortable raising those issues and having those conversations? If you have leadership where, they don't seem to feel like there's an issue, but people that are being impacted by it do feel as though there's an issue, how do you create a culture where people are comfortable having those conversations, which are often difficult?
Yeah, they are difficult conversations. And I'd say, I mentioned that we have town halls, and they are really tough conversations to start to combat. Two things come to mind. So at Nielsen, as a data and ratings firm, we have a saying, what gets measured gets managed. And with that saying, two things come to mind. The first is transparency with the measurement piece. So understanding where you are exactly with your numbers, with your representation, with your goals, where do you want to be? Todd, I really enjoyed hearing you say, people are saying, look around, right? But there's a way that you can measure that. You can actually count and see and have benchmarks, to stack yourself up against competitors, your industry, the US population. There are several ways that you can look at it. And so it really starts with just understanding where you are and starting to build a roadmap for where you want to go. Now, how you get there comes to the management piece, and that is, to me, accountability at the leadership level. And so at Nielsen, what we have done is we've moved from less of a programmatic strategy where we have programs, ERGs, for example, to help support and develop some of our lower represented affinities. And now we're moving into more systemic embedding of inclusion and diversity. And so what that looks like is, holding our leadership accountable. Here, here's CEO, here's CFO, or whatever our C-suite member is. This is the makeup of your organization. And there is an opportunity to fix it. And I think that if you have the importance and accountability for your leadership to make those changes, you will start to feel some of those trickle down effects. I think that, then the leadership can't say they didn't know, or, hey, the two people that I work closely with are different from me. That's not the same. And so what we're really trying to do is embed inclusion through all of our processes, from attraction to who we're attracting, who we're hiring, what that interview process looks like, all the way through to, do we have differentiated development programs and opportunities for our diverse talent to stick around, right? Because we don't want attrition to be high as well. And so we want all of those numbers to be equally as important as other business metrics, such as the financial ones. People metrics are equally important. And so when you hold your leadership accountable, they start to make those changes and you start to feel a real impact.
Wendy, on behalf of Sony Pictures, have you found, so Kimberly just provided a tremendous amount of insight in terms of the entire pipeline, because you're right, that when we cite a lack of diversity, often we'll point to different areas. Well, it's a pipeline problem, we just don't have enough candidates. But usually that's just not addressing what the actual issue is. So at Sony, what have you found to be effective in terms of strengthening your diversity and representation throughout the entire pipeline, from attracting people into positions within the company, ensuring that you're hiring from a diverse pool, and then also ensuring that that diversity is fostered throughout? Because as you know, what we tend to find is that we become less diverse the higher up the ladder we go, when we're more diverse at the lower levels. So how have you been able to combat that?
So I know in the conversations that I've had with our recruiting team, they've really gone to great lengths to go outside of sort of their core recruiting pools that not normally, but that, traditionally and historically they've gone to, right? Colleges, universities, and whatnot. Well, how many of those colleges and universities were HBCUs? It was a very small amount. Okay, well, let's bolster that. Let's get that, to be a larger percentage. There's an amazing organization called TransCan Work. Are we recruiting with them to bring in transgender people into our organization? So I think it's the HR teams looking at where they're recruiting and how they can broaden out and reach into other pools to sort of get more diverse candidates coming in. So that's number one. And I'm not in HR, so I don't want to get too specific, but I've had conversations and I know that they've looked at that from an organizational standpoint. But most importantly, you're right. A lot of the diversity is seen at the lower levels, assistants coming in, coordinators coming in, and then they hit a sort of glass ceiling and they don't rise any further. And I think that that's where the e-bridges come in. I think that if we get people really involved, they become invested in the company and they can sort of learn and grow through these organizations that are very supportive of them. But I also think mentorship is vitally, vitally important. As somebody who manages a team of people, looking at my team, looking at, who the coordinator is on the team and how can I help them rise up through the ranks. I've been at Sony Pictures for 21 years and I've had two bosses, and one of which saw me come in as a coordinator straight from a movie theater company and really mentored me for my entire career, all the way up from a coordinator to a senior vice president. Everybody on this call knows it's Ann Elizabeth Crotty, who is an amazing human being, but I had that mentor. And so what she's now passed on to me is to become a mentor myself. And that's what I do through the e-bridges and the various people I have coffee with, is how can I help you make that next step? How can it, who can I introduce you to? What are you interested in? I think it's vitally important for those of us who are now at the executive level to sort of reach back down and help pull up the assistants, the coordinators, the people who are just coming into the organization.
Todd, that goes back to what you were saying with your Rose Bowl experience, which is that if you give people an opportunity to come to the meetings and to learn and to be met and to get to know others, that tends to help bridge those gaps and help people propel to the next level.
Yeah, my experience was the mentoring was about social norms, not knowledge necessarily, not work ethic, because these people brought that to the table. What they didn't know, and to keep it simple, was the rules of the game. How does this work around here? How do we like to do things around here? And once they learned the norms, they assimilated quickly. They understood it, they got it, they knew, they understood when I'm on, when I'm off, when I should keep my mouth shut, when I should speak up and say something, when my opinion matters. They really, once the norms were established, and this is just my experience, I'm not telling you this is the way it should work. This is only an experience I've had. It really took effect. And that was the type of mentoring that we implied, that we created out in Pasadena. And lo and behold, 10 years later, we've had 3 female presidents of the organization, an Asian, an African American, and a good buddy of mine who is Latino. He's up next, and that all happened rather quickly as soon as they got in the pipeline, as we'll say. But just understanding, okay, I see how this works. Okay.
Okay. I think probably before we begin the Q&A, we may only have time for about one more question. And so I'd like to ask each of you the same one. Kimberly, I'd like to start with you. Many of the people that are dialed in today are not necessarily members of high-level leadership within their organizations, or they're not members of the HR department, or they may not have the ability to launch an employee resource group or to make decisions that are materially impactful to the company from an autonomous level. So for the people that are listening today, what is one thing that you would recommend that they could do to start to have a meaningful role in improving awareness and diversity and inclusion within their company, within this industry, within society in general?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say it certainly starts with genuine allyship. There are lots of opportunities in our day-to-day that we can choose differently, right? We can think about, who we are surrounded with, who we invite to meetings, who we spend time with in a workplace setting, and we can choose differently. We can choose to step outside of our comfort zone and start to ask those questions and start to engage in, with populations that are different from you. I would say that, there is a lot of bias at play. That's another piece that I think we should all be aware of. And certainly we can't get rid of bias. We all have it. It's a survival tactic, but certainly we can mitigate the impact and start to think more consciously when we are approaching these decisions that we make on a day-to-day basis. And so usually what I like to do is to encourage people to slow down, right? And to think. Diversity is not rocket science, right? And inclusion, as Wendy mentioned, is really about your behaviors. And so if you start to more consciously think about, why did I think that way? Or, what similarities do I see in the people that I spend most of my time with? You'll start to be confronted with some opportunities to choose differently and to step outside of those zones that you usually play within, to start to expand your horizon. And then what you'll start to learn is more inclusive leadership, right? It's almost a language that you have to start to pick up. And so you'll feel that you are, including more, that you are being more thoughtful, that you are valuing those different perspectives because they are ultimately making you better.
Thank you for that. Rolando, I'd like to ask you that same question next. What is one thing that you would tell everyone on this call today that they can start doing rather immediately to improve our diversity and inclusiveness?
Look, I think the most important that they can do is recognize that there's strengths and differences. And that means that you have to step back and recognize that that we all have biases, obviously, as several members indicate on this panel. But the reality is that I don't know what it's like to be a woman. I don't know what it's like to be Black. I don't know what it's like to be Asian. I don't know what it's like to be gay. But you know what? If I'm an effective leader, then I should surround myself with leaders of that capability, because they represent consumerism, they represent workforce, they represent the future. And as a leader, if you're not thinking about that, and you're only going to look through one lens, you're going to miss an incredible growth opportunity, and you're not going to do the right thing, not only for your company, for your shareholders, and for your organization at large. And I think part of that is you have to look around the room and the people that report to you or the people that you work alongside and make sure that there's differences. And those differences have to be put on the table and have those honest conversations to make the very best decisions possible. I mean, look, I know I'm going back to my original comments, but it goes back to, you know, when did Blacks start becoming superheroes? That's just recent. You know, look at Hispanics, and the roles of Hispanics were always the banditos and the bad guys and the drug dealers, right? And women were basically always saved by the men, right? In the movies. That's our industry, right? That's our industry. And we've started to now see a change that's starting to happen in that behavior. And I think that change is coming from people that are starting to recognize that we have an incredible consumer base that wants to see them properly represented on the screen. And we as an industry have a tremendous opportunity to make that difference.
Thank you. Todd, can I ask you that question next? Is there one thing that you would send people with today in terms of what they can do that's actionable?
You know, this answer may be not what you were expecting, but my message is to the minorities that are on this webinar. Be comfortable with being the other person in the room. Be okay with that. Love what you're doing, believe in it, and be passionate. And work hard and play the long game. You're going to have to take some baby steps. You may never get to the level that you believe you deserve, but someone coming up behind you will. It's a ladder. They're going to stand on your shoulders. And that's what I was taught. That's what my neighborhood believed in. That's what my family believed in. You've got to grind. And yet, understand that there are some rules out there. And one of the rules is you got to be really, really good. There is no room not much room for error. You have to be excellent at what you do to make sure you get past some of the stereotypes and some of the misperceptions and just the lack of being invited. Just be so darn good at what you do and care so much about it that they cannot not invite you to something. And so that's my message. My message is you got to grind. For the minorities out there, plug away and just keep pushing the cause forward. And it'll happen. There's just a few too many of us, you know, wanting attention and not earning it. I think Rolando alluded to that earlier. You got to be prepared. You have to be ready. And that is so true. You better be ready and you better be prepared. Because if you get pulled in, there are some huge expectations on you. You represent not just yourself, but your community.
Thank you. And Wendy, last but not least, what's something that you would tell the group that they can walk away with that's actionable?
Don't be afraid to ask that question. Of any of us, of anybody who may be different from you, of anybody who may be above you, don't be afraid to just ask the question and talk to them. Sometimes it's difficult and it's hard, but opening that line of communication, because I started in this industry as a concession worker. When I was 16 years old, I worked at a movie theater in Bakersfield as a kid, and look where I'm at now. I didn't get here by not asking questions and not striving. And Todd's absolutely right. You stand on the shoulders of the people that came before you. When I went from the movie theater to work in the United Artists home office, well before Regal bought them, I was the first kid they ever hired from a movie theater to work in the corporate office. And what came with me was this vast amount of knowledge that they didn't realize that you could get from working in a theater. Obviously, this was 25 plus years ago and things have changed tremendously. But I was glad to be the first person on that ladder. And then I got to see other people take that same path and go much higher than I ever did, which is unbelievable and amazing. But don't be afraid to ask that question. Don't be afraid to have informational interviews with people. Don't be afraid to just step forward, even if it's through email. If that's where you're comfortable, do it through email, do it through LinkedIn, but don't be afraid to have that question and just ask how you can be a better ally or what you can do to take the next step.
Thank you, Wendy, and thank you, everyone. At this point, we are at the Q&A portion. So Tony, if you are on the line, I'll turn it over to you to see if we've gotten any questions through our chat throughout the course of our panel discussion.
All right. Again, thank you for everybody for participating, our panel, as well as everybody that has, we have about 130 people throughout the whole panel discussion. Thanks for everybody for taking your time out the day to join us. So the first question I have for everybody on the panel, how does a female employee negotiate salary when dealing with the 25% wage gap between men and women?
Okay, so we're coming out strong with our questions. I might direct that actually over to Wendy and or Kimberly. Wendy, would you like to address that question about pay disparity?
Pay disparity is difficult, and Kimberly, you could probably talk about this. I mean, it's you know, even at my level, we are faced with this same exact issue and the same exact problem. You have to advocate for yourself, and you have to fight for what you know is that difference. I don't have any tips and tools. I still battle this even at my stage in my career. So it's, you have to not only be your own advocate and as Todd alluded to earlier, have all of the information that you can possibly have when you're negotiating your salary, all the information. You've got to go in there, not guns a-blazing, but you've got to go in there with an entire binder of information as to why you should be paid what you should be paid, irrespective of what the other people that you're comparing yourself against. You need to go in there for yourself and do that. But you also need to develop allies outside of yourself that can back you up and that can also fight for that as well. I mean, that's kind of what I've done in my career. Kimberly?
Yeah, I think everything you said, Wendy, is true, right? Advocating for yourself, and certainly, you know, picking up some negotiation skills when it comes to those types of conversations, being armed with industry knowledge, with benchmarking and the value that you bring, and trying to quantify that in a way that you can. What I will offer on the flip side is 25 is a massive gap, right? And I think that you know, one of the things that we're doing at Nielsen is doing a pay equity analysis to make sure that at least most people are on equal playing field. The other thing I'll offer, just from an HR perspective, one of the ways in which we're trying to taper that is standardizing our job descriptions, right? And having and identifying critical role criteria and making sure that all the candidates that we meet are assessed fairly and with the same standardization. So certainly, you know, on the talent acquisition side, there are things that we're trying to work on to make sure that we are not running into those types of issues and that we are not a company that has those types of gaps that need to be closed.
Thank you. Tony, we may have time for one more question.
All right, one more. All right, and this will be for everybody in the panel. What are some challenges you personally faced throughout your career with respect to diversity and inclusion?
I think
Todd, if you don't, yeah, Todd, I'll direct that to you first if you don't mind.
Oh, I was going to say Rolanda. You gotta have
No,
respect
you're
for
up.
the elder.
Nope.
Wow.
Elder. Uh-oh.
Oh,
This is going south quickly.
So Tony, tell me the question again. I want to make sure I answer it correctly.
All right, no problem. What are some challenges you have personally faced throughout your career with respect to diversity and inclusion?
You know, there's not enough time to answer that question. I'm gonna give one challenge. And someone asked on the Q&A, it's just people revealing themselves, their racist nature, their sexist nature, and having to decide at that split moment, do I address this or do I let it go and keep going? That's been the biggest challenge and continues to be the biggest challenge. I hear it too often. I heard it just the other day at my dentist office, of all people, and I love my dentist, but he let it out. He let it out, and I said, oh my God. All right, just finished working on my teeth. My mouth is open right now. Just finish up so I can get out of here. But that's my biggest challenge, is trying to decide when to fight that good fight and when to let it go.
Orlando, if you wouldn't mind answering that question as well, I think that's where we'll end for today. Can you talk about any challenges you faced?
Sure, and if you don't mind, I'll just touch briefly on the 25% equity. And I think that Kimberly really touched on it. One is the benchmarking aspect, and frankly, it's one of the things that we've done in our organization, and I've started to see in more companies out there. The benchmarking is critical. And by the way, one of the things I would say, this is where the head of HR earns their jobs, in my mind, because this is where they need to make sure that there is the benchmarking, the midpoints, and that everyone is being treated equally. So I think that's starting to change, and that's an important factor that needs to be followed through. And I'll tie it into this last question because, look, one of the things that we face, and I've faced obviously through the course of my career, one of the things I would say to all diverse individuals is, number one, don't ever be a victim. And I think Todd alluded to that. Don't ever be a victim. And because we're going to face adversity, we're going to face the bar being set higher than it's set for others at times. The expectations are going to be much higher. The fact that I'm a CEO and I'm held at a pretty high standard, you know, being one of the few Hispanics, you know, CEOs in our industries, absolutely, always measured, always second guessed, and that's going to happen. But that's where the opportunity really lies, right? And this is where you set the stage for others to follow. And you have to make sure that you can stand strong and be able to take those shots. And by the way, those shots don't stop coming. As Todd indicated, that could be at your dentist office, that could be at your office, that could be at one of your board meetings, that could be at one of the community events that you attend. And I think what our responsibility are as diverse leaders is to help educate and change that trajectory. And what I mean by that is pull those folks aside, have a proper dialogue with them, explain where that miss actually happens. And I find that's an inherent responsibility on me now, as I've grown through the ranks through the course of many years, that I have to obviously speak up for the folks that can't speak up. And I need to make sure that I, you know, stop them at a moment and share those thoughts. And I think we're in an opportune time in our country where that conversation is being listened a lot more to than it was probably 6 months ago. And so we have that ability to make some changes now.
Thank you. Well, this has been wonderful. This has been very, very informative and insightful for me, and I hope it's been very informative and insightful for our other panel members and for everyone who took the time to join us on the call today. We covered a little bit. I feel like we could cover so much more. So I anticipate this being the first of many events that you'll see from the Film Row Lead group addressing these topics and related topics. You will be getting a survey for everyone who dialed in on the call. Please take the time to fill that out and give us your feedback about today's event, because the Film Row Lead team is dedicated to continually bringing events that are impactful, that drive conversation that's meaningful, and change that is long lasting. And they could use your help with that. So once again, thank you everyone for your time and have a great day.
Thank you.
We'll see you next time.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Film Row.